On the 41st floor of the Hartwell Tower at 11 at night, a man in a $2,000 suit leaned back in his chair and laughed at the way a woman said the word water. She had only asked if he wanted the wastebasket emptied. He told her to say it again. He told the two younger executives beside him to listen, and he made her repeat the sentence twice while they smiled into their phones. "Say water," he said, drawing it out, and the younger one bit down on a grin. "What?" She said it the third time, the same as the first, calm, even, her chin level, and then she emptied his wastebasket and wiped the ring his coffee cup had left on the glass and pushed her cart toward the next office without a word. The wheel of the cart had a small squeak in it, the same squeak it had carried for 11 months, and she heard it go down the long hall behind her like a held breath. She did not look back. She did not change her step. A woman learns early which insults are worth the turning of her head, and this one, from this man, was not. What Bratkeen did not know as he watched her go and felt pleased with himself was that the cleaning woman he had just mocked owned more of the company he ran than he ever would. He did not know that the paycheck he had cashed that morning, and the one before it, and everyone for the last 6 years, had been authorized under a trust whose final signature was hers. He did not know her name. He thought he did. He had read it off her badge and gotten it wrong on purpose. Her name was Adaze. The people on the night crew called her Ada. And she had been cleaning that building for 11 months on purpose, for reasons not one person on the 41st floor could have guessed. To understand why, you have to go back. Adaze had come to this country at 26, with a chemistry degree from a university in Enugu that nobody here had heard of. 2 suitcases, and a husband named Emeka, who believed the way other men believed in luck. Emeka was an engineer, careful and kind, and he had a small idea about water filtration that he was sure could become a large idea if someone would only let it breathe. For 8 years, nobody let it breathe. He drew his diagrams at the kitchen table after his shift at the plant, and Adaze typed his letters and corrected his English and held the household together on a nurse's aide salary and the tips she made cleaning model homes on the weekend. They had one daughter, Ngozi, a quiet girl with her father's patience and her mother's spine, and they raised her in a 2-bedroom apartment where the radiator knocked all winter and the rent went up every spring. Then a man with money finally let the idea breathe. His name was Gideon Hartwell, and he was old even then, and he had built the tower that bore his name out of a single hardware store on the south side. He met Emeka at a county inventors fair, the kind of thing nobody important ever goes to, and he listened to a soft-spoken engineer explain how a cheap ceramic membrane could pull poison out of well water for pennies, and something in the old man woke up. He put his own money behind it. He gave Emeka a lab and a salary and a third of a new company, and for the first time in his life, Emeka came home some nights too excited to eat. He did not get to enjoy it long. The week the first municipal contract came through, Emeka's heart stopped on a Sunday morning while he was tying his shoes to go to church. He was 41, Adaze was 39, Ngozi was 11. What Adaze inherited was grief, a folder of legal papers she could barely read through her tears, and a third of a company that was about to be worth more than she could imagine. Gideon Hartwell came to the funeral. He sat in the back, an old white man in a grey coat among a crowd of mourners who did not know him. And afterward, he found her in the church kitchen washing serving trays because she did not know what else to do with her hands. He did not offer condolences in the way the others had. He took a dish towel off the rack and started drying. They washed dishes together for an hour. He scraped, she rinsed, he dried, and neither of them rushed it, because the dishes were a kindness to her hands and they both knew it. He told her plainly that Emeka had been the most honest man he had met in 40 years of business, and that the company they had started was going to make a great deal of money, and that he intended to see that her share was protected to the last dollar, because he had watched too many widows get cheated by clever men in good suits, and he would not have it on his conscience. He told her she did not have to understand the legal machinery. She told him she would learn it anyway. He looked at her a long moment and said that did not surprise him. Before he left, he wrote a telephone number on the back of a church bulletin and pressed it into her wet hand and closed her fingers over it. "Call me," he said. "When anyone tells you that you cannot understand a thing, they always say it to the people who understand it best. Then he put on his grey coat and walked out into the cold. An old man nobody at the funeral had thought worth greeting, and she stood there holding a paper towel and a phone number, and the first plain decency anyone outside her own kitchen had shown her in months. He was as good as his word. Over the next years, as the filtration technology spread from one county to a dozen states, Gideon Hartwell folded the small company into the larger holding structure he controlled, and he made certain that Amika's third converted into a controlling interest in the trust that sat above all of it. He taught Adaze to read a balance sheet at his own kitchen table, the way he might have taught a granddaughter. He explained what a board was and what it could and could not do. He explained that ownership was quiet, that the people who ran a company day to day almost never knew who truly held it, and that this could be a weakness or it could be a kind of armor depending on the woman who wore it. When Gideon Hartwell died 4 years before the night with the wastebasket, he left Adaze something that startled even her. He left her his own controlling stake layered on top of her husband's, placed in trust with her as the sole signatory once Ngozi came of age. On paper, through 3 holding companies and a name nobody would think to question, the woman who pushed the cleaning cart through the Hartwell Tower at night owned the building, the firm inside it, and the authority over every contract, every budget, and every paycheck that left it. She had told almost no one, not because she was hiding, because she was deciding. That is the part the powerful never quite understood. Adaze had spent her whole adult life being underestimated, and she had learned that the truest thing about a person came out only when they thought no one who mattered was watching. The company her husband had bled for was now hers to keep, sell, or remake. Before she decided what to do with it, she wanted to know what it had become, not from a quarterly report, not from the polished men who would tell her exactly what they thought she wanted to hear. She wanted to know it the way Gideon had known his hardware store, from the floor, at night, with a rag in her hand. So she signed on with the building's cleaning vendor under her own first name and her late husband's surname, which on a badge meant nothing to anyone, and she took the night shift on the executive floors. For 11 months she had emptied their wastebaskets and learned their faces and read, without meaning to, the small daily evidence people leave behind when they think the help cannot understand them. She learned a great deal. She learned which executives stayed late to actually work and which stayed late to be seen staying. She learned the smell of each floor, the burnt coffee on 38, the lemon polish on the marble in the lobby, the cold metal and paper smell of the accounting floor at 4 in the morning. She learned that the woman who ran that accounting floor, a calm, grey-haired manager named Harriet, came in at 5 each day and left small handwritten notes on the desks of her tired staff, a single line each. "You're doing better than you think. Take the lunch you keep skipping," and that she signed none of them. Adaze had read a dozen of those notes while she dusted, and had quietly decided that a building which still grew people like Harriet was a building worth saving. She learned, too, about a young analyst named Devon. He was perhaps 25, careful, the kind of young man who triple-checked his own work and apologized when he held a door. For 3 nights a week his car sat in the lower level of the garage past midnight with the seat reclined, and she understood why the night she found him at his desk at 2 in the morning, asleep over his keyboard with a hospital invoice folded under it. She read the top line of it without meaning to. It was for a course of treatment for a woman with his same last name, and the balance after insurance was a number that would have made most grown men weep. She had heard from the building grapevine that flows through every cleaning crew that he had signed his whole hiring bonus over to his mother's care and kept nothing. She did not wake him. She took the spare grey coat that hung on the side of her cart and laid it over his shoulders, and she turned off the lamp at his elbow so the light would not wake him, and she pushed her cart on and never said a word about it to anyone then or after. And she learned about Brant Keene. Brant Keene ran the company's largest division, the Municipal Water Contracts Division, the very business her husband had invented. He was 46, tall, expensively dressed, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone he could not fire. He was good at the parts of his job that involved a room and a microphone. He was less good, Adaze came to understand, at the parts that involved the truth. She had watched him for 11 months. She had emptied his wastebasket 200 times. She had read the body language of the people who walked out of his office, and she had learned to tell the difference between the ones who agreed with him and the ones who were simply afraid. The night he mocked her accent was not the first cruelty she had seen from him. It was only the first he had aimed at her. She did not lie awake over it. She had been called worse by better men, and she had a daughter in her second year of medical school and a quiet apartment and a faith that told her a man's contempt said everything about him and nothing about her. She went home that night, took off her shoes, and prayed the same plain prayer she prayed every night, that she would be given the wisdom to do the right thing and the patience to wait until she could see what the right thing was. Still, something had shifted, and she felt it. For 11 months she had been only watching. The man's small laugh had moved her one step closer to deciding. She had wanted to know what her husband's company had become. Now she was beginning to see it, and what she saw was a fine and faithful body of work, the kind Gideon and Amika had built, with a sickness growing in one of its limbs, and the sickness had a name and a corner office and a way of making other people say water. The next morning she did something she had not done in all her time on the night crew. She made a phone call. She called the one man besides her lawyer who knew exactly who she was. His name was Festus Asika, a soft-spoken accountant Gideon had trusted, the man who had quietly administered the trust since the old man died. She asked him to pull everything on the Municipal Contracts Division for the last 3 years, not the summaries, the raw files, the bid documents, the vendor invoices, the margin reports, the division sent up to the board. She asked him to send them to the small apartment where she read her husband's old diagrams on Sunday afternoons. Festus asked her, gently, if it was time. She said she did not know yet. She said she only wanted to read. The files arrived as Festus always did things, quietly and completely, in 3 plain boxes, a courier left at her door before dawn. She read them the way Emeka had taught her, to read anything that mattered, slowly, twice, with a pencil in her hand. She would come home at 1 in the morning, still smelling of the floors, run a bath she was too tired to take, make a cup of tea she would forget to drink, and sit at the same kitchen table where Amika had drawn his diagrams, and she would read until the windows turned grey. What she read over the next 3 weeks, with her reading glasses sliding down her nose and the tea going cold beside her, was a story she had seen the shape of from the night floor and now saw the proof of in numbers. Brant Keen's division was winning contracts. It should not have been winning at prices that did not add up, and the gap was being papered over in a way that took her, with her dead husband's careful mind and her own slow, chemistry-trained patience, 11 nights to fully understand. The division was bidding municipal water projects at numbers that looked competitive on the surface. To make those numbers work, it was quietly substituting a cheaper membrane in the field, a thinner ceramic from an overseas supplier that failed faster than the one the bid specified. The savings were booked as margin. The failures were booked months later and in a different ledger as warranty service, which a different vice president signed off on, which never landed on the same page as the contracts that caused them. It was the kind of thing that looked, from the top, like a star division run by a brilliant man. It was the kind of thing that looked, from the chemistry, like a town somewhere drinking water through a membrane that would let the poison back through in 3 years instead of 15. Ade set down her tea and sat very still for a long time. Her husband had invented that membrane so that a child in a village like the one he came from could drink water without dying of it. And a man in a corner office had quietly swapped it for something cheaper so that his numbers would shine, and had mocked the way she said the word for the very thing he was poisoning. She did not cry. She did not call her lawyer that night, though her hand hovered over the phone. She had learned from Gideon that anger is a poor signature. A decision made in anger is a decision made for the other person, on their schedule, in their language. She would make this one in her own. She kept cleaning. That was the part Ngozi did not understand. When her mother finally told her some of it over the phone, late on a Thursday, while the girl was supposed to be studying for an anatomy exam. "Why keep emptying that man's wastebasket?" her daughter asked, her voice climbing. "When you could walk in tomorrow and end him." Because Ade said, "I am not finished learning." And because the people in that building, who did nothing wrong, deserve a steady hand, not a storm. "You always do this," Ngozi said. "You wait." Daddy waited 8 years, and look. And there was a silence on the line because the girl heard herself say it and was sorry. And Adaze let the silence sit a moment before she answered. "Your father waited," she said, "and because he waited the right way, 100 towns drink clean water tonight that would not have." Waiting is not the same as nothing, Ngozi. It only looks the same from the outside. "And him," her daughter said again, softer now, and Adaze smiled at the word in the dark of her kitchen, because her quiet girl carried her father's patience and her mother's backbone, and tonight the backbone had come up first. What she was waiting for, though she could not have said it cleanly even to herself, was for Brandt Keane to show the building who he was without her having to tell them. A man revealed is harder to dispute than a man accused. He showed them sooner than she expected, and he aimed it again at her. It started with the analyst sleeping in his car. Devon, the young man with the hospital bill, had been quietly moved to Keane's division 3 months earlier and had begun, with the earnest carefulness of a person who still believed the numbers were supposed to be true, to ask questions about the warranty figures. He did not know what he was looking at. He only knew that 2 ledgers that should have matched did not, and he made the mistake of putting it in an email, and he made the larger mistake of being honest in a meeting. Brandt Keane did not raise his voice. Adaze, polishing the glass of the conference room wall in the dim outside the meeting, watched it all through the reflection without seeming to watch anything at all. She had wiped that same panel of glass 100 nights and knew exactly where to stand to see a whole room without being seen to look. He smiled at the young analyst across the table and said the numbers were complicated, that there were context items above his pay grade, that some people were simply not ready for senior work, and there was no shame in it. He said it kindly. That was the thing about him that took her longest to name, that his cruelty wore the face of patience. Within a week, Devon's system access was being walked back, a permission at a time, his 2 best projects quietly reassigned to other desks, his name attached to a vague note in a personnel file about not being a culture fit. The young man who had signed his hiring bonus over to his sick mother was being arranged, slowly and expertly, into the shape of the person who would take the fall if anyone ever opened those 2 ledgers and laid them side by side. That was the active hand Adaze had been waiting to see. Not the laugh. The architecture. Brandt Keane did not merely cut corners. He built, in advance, the story of who would be blamed when the corners were found, and he chose, for that story, the most vulnerable, honest person in his reach. She made her decision then. She did not make it in anger. She made it the way her husband used to finish a diagram, with everything in its place and nothing left to chance. First, she protected the boy. She had Festus arrange, through the trust's authority and without a name attached, for every document Devon had touched to be preserved, time-stamped, and copied out of the division before it could be quietly deleted. She had the analyst's flanked email pulled and archived where Keane could not reach it. When Keane's office requested that certain server logs be cleaned up as routine maintenance, the maintenance request was approved, processed, and the originals were already gone where he would never think to look, into the same quiet trust machinery that had protected a widow from men in suits 20 years before. Then she did something that to anyone watching the surface made no sense at all. She arranged through the building's vendor office to be assigned to clean the executive conference room during the quarterly division review, the biggest meeting of Keane's year. The one where he stood in front of the senior leadership and the visiting board members and presented his division's gleaming numbers. The morning of the review, Adaze came in early, before the catering, before the assistants. She wore her grey cleaning uniform with the badge that said the wrong name. She wiped down the long table until the glass threw back the ceiling lights in a clean, unbroken line. She set out the water glasses, 1 at each place, and filled the 2 heavy pitchers and set a slice of lemon floating in each, the way the executive floor liked it. Then she took up her cloth and moved to the side credenza, along the wall where a cleaner is invisible, and she waited while the room filled with suits. Harriet from accounting came in with a folder held against her chest and took a seat halfway down. Two members of the board arrived together, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain and a quiet man who said little. A row of division. Vice presidents filed in and arranged their phones face down in front of them. Devon came last, pale, and sat near the door like a young man who had been summoned to his own sentencing and could not work out why. And at the head of the long table stood Brant Keane, in a suit that cost more than the analyst's monthly rent, easy and bright, clicking to his first slide and beginning to speak about the future of the municipal water division as though he, and not a dead engineer at a kitchen table, had dreamed the whole thing up. He was perhaps 10 minutes in, deep into a slide about margin expansion, when he noticed the woman in grey still wiping the credenza and made a small joke about it. He asked her, in front of the board, whether she understood any of this, and he stretched out the word margin slowly, the way a person speaks to a child, and a few people laughed because he was powerful, and the laugh was free. Adaise set down her cloth. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said, in her even, accented English, that she understood it well enough to know the margin on slide 11 was not margin at all. She said the division's stated margin on the three largest municipal contracts depended on a field substitution of a thinner ceramic membrane than the bids specified, that the cost of the resulting failures was being carried as warranty expense under a different vice president's signature so that the two numbers never appeared on the same page, and that if anyone in the room would like to turn to the warranty ledger for the prior 3 quarters, they would find the failures of the very contracts on slide 11, hiding in plain sight. The room went very quiet. Brant Keane laughed, but the laugh came out wrong, too high, and he said that the cleaning staff should not be in the room and that this was an extraordinary breach and that he would be speaking to the vendor. He reached for the easy thing, the thing that had always worked, which was the size of the gap between his suit and her uniform. He said it was absurd. He said with an edge now that she should say margin again, that perhaps she had simply misheard a word she could not pronounce. It was the wrong thing to say, and not for the reason he thought. She had not raised her voice once, and she did not raise it now. She only pronounced it for him, clearly, as she had pronounced it 10,000 times to a husband learning her, to a daughter learning the world, to an old man drying dishes who had told her she would understand what others claimed she could not. Margin, she said. Then she said, and it is missing from your slide. And a town in the 3rd county is drinking the difference. She watched the room hear her, every syllable landing where it was meant to, and she understood in that moment that the accent he had mocked was the clearest voice at the table. I want to stop here a moment, because this is the part people remember, not the numbers, the quiet. A woman with a cloth in her hand, standing where no one had bothered to look, saying a true thing in a steady voice, while the powerful man across from her began, very slightly, to sweat. If you have ever been that woman in any room, you already know how this should go. Stay with her a little longer. One of the board members, the older woman with the reading glasses, a person Harriet had worked under years before, and still spoke of with respect, asked quietly that the warranty ledger be brought up on the screen. Keane said it was not relevant. The board member said she would like to see it anyway. There was a pause, and a young technician in the corner, with the whole room watching, pulled up the warranty figures beside the contract slide, and the two numbers sat next to each other for the first time in 3 years. They did not match the story Keane had been telling. They matched exactly the story the cleaning woman had told, standing beside the credenza with a cloth still in her hand. Brant Keane began to defend himself, and here is where a lesser man would have crumbled, and where he, to his credit as an opponent, did not. He was clever, and he was cornered, and he turned the full weight of his cleverness on the only target that had ever failed to fight back. He said the substitution had been a supply chain decision made below him. He said the analyst, Devon, had managed those vendor relationships and had hidden the failures, and he produced, smoothly from a folder he had apparently kept ready, a set of documents with the young man's name on them, a paper trail built over weeks to point at the most vulnerable, honest person in his reach. He said it with the confidence of a man who had won every argument of his life by being the one who had prepared the file. And for a moment, it worked. The room turned toward the pale young analyst by the door, and Devon stood, and could not speak because the documents had his name on them and he did not understand how. Adaze spoke once more. She said the documents, Mr. Quat, Keane was holding had been created in the last 6 weeks after the questions started, and that the original vendor records, the ones with the real dates, still existed, and that they showed the membrane substitution had been ordered 18 months before the analyst ever joined the division by an authorization that traced, through 3 signatures, back to the head of the division himself. She said this could all be confirmed because the server logs Mr. Keane's office had recently requested be cleaned up as routine maintenance had been preserved in full before that cleanup and were available, time-stamped, to anyone the board wished to appoint. Brant Keane stared at her. For the first time in 11 months he was actually looking at her, and he asked her, the arrogance draining out of his voice and something colder coming in, who she was. It was Festus Asika who answered, because Adaze had asked him to be there, seated quietly among the board staff, in a plain dark suit where no one had thought to question him. He set down his pen and stood. An unremarkable man, soft-spoken, the kind of man rooms overlook in exactly the way they had overlooked the woman with the cloth. He said that he administered the trust that held the controlling interest in the company, and he named the trust. And 2 of the vice presidents went very still, because they had seen that name at the top of documents their whole careers and never once wondered who stood behind it. He said the woman Mr. Keane was addressing was the sole signatory of that trust. He said her late husband had invented the very membrane the division had spent 3 years quietly replacing with something that failed in the ground. And he said, in the same level tone the woman herself used, that she had owned, for the entire 11 months, Mr. Keane had been making her repeat her words for the amusement of a hallway, the company that signed his paychecks. No one laughed now. Adaze did not gloat. She did not lecture him. She had watched her husband die at 41 with his shoes half tied, and she knew the size of what mattered and the size of what did not, and a humbled man in an expensive suit was not large enough to spend her satisfaction on. She simply set her cloth on the credenza and folded her hands in front of her and waited, as she had waited those 11 long months, as she had waited 8 years at a kitchen table while the world overlooked the kindest man she ever knew. The board did the rest. They did not need her to. Brant Keane was placed on leave within the hour and gone within the month, his exit quiet, his contracts pulled and rebid honestly, his fabricated file against the analyst dissolving the moment the real dates were laid beside it. There was no shouting, no perp walk, none of the spectacle Ngozi had wanted on her mother's behalf. There was only the slow, certain work of a man being measured by what he had actually done and found wanting. The membrane substitution was reversed in every active contract at the company's own expense, which cost a great deal of money and saved an amount of suffering no ledger would ever record in towns whose names Adaze made a point of learning. Devon, the analyst who had slept in his car, was called into a small office a week later and offered a position he had not applied for, reporting directly to Harriet in accounting, with a salary that he read 3 times, because he was sure he had misplaced the decimal. Harriet slid the letter across the desk and watched him do the arithmetic and told him before he could ask that there was no error, that the number was the number, and that he should go home and sleep in a bed. His mother's last round of treatment was covered before the month was out by a fund the company had never advertised and could not quite explain administered, like so many quiet things, through an office on a lower floor under a name people were still learning to pronounce. He never learned for certain who had covered him with a coat in the dark months before, or who had preserved the documents that cleared his name when a clever man came holding a folder with the wrong dates in it. He suspected. He had once stayed past 3 in the morning and seen the night cleaner from the executive floor sitting at an empty desk under a single lamp, reading a printed balance sheet with the calm focus of a person to whom every line of it was plain, and he had told himself he was overtired and seeing things and gone home. After that meeting, he stopped telling himself that. He let himself keep the thought instead, the way you keep a warm coat, and he never said it out loud to anyone because some debts are paid best by simply becoming the kind of person who would have done the same. Adaze did not return to the night shift. There was no more reason to. She had learned what she came to learn, and she had decided what she came to decide. She did not sell her husband's company. She kept it, and she remade it, slowly, with everything in its place, and nothing left to chance. She took a real office, at last, on a lower floor, with a plain desk and a window that looked at the next building rather than the skyline, and she ran the trust in the open, now, under her own full name. The executives learned to pronounce it. They learned to say "adays" every syllable, because the woman who signed their paychecks said it that way, and because she had a quiet manner of waiting until a thing was said correctly that no one cared to test more than once. The first vice president, who tried to charm her with a shortened version of it, a friendly addy at the end of a meeting, watched her look at him pleasantly and say nothing at all until he heard himself, in the silence, and corrected it. He never tried again, neither did anyone who saw it. She put her husband's name back on the division. The municipal water division, the one that poisoned nothing, now was renamed for the soft-spoken engineer who had drawn his first diagram at a kitchen table after his shift, and a small brass plate with his name went up by the door of the lab he never got to see finished. She did not make a speech about it, she did not call the staff together or invite a photographer. She simply approved the order the way she approved 100 orders and let the people who worked there discover the new name on the wall some ordinary Monday and make of it what they would. Days went down to look at it the day it was installed, in the quiet of an early morning, before the floor filled, when the lab smelled of clean steel and the test rigs ticked softly as they warmed. The plate was small and plain, just his name and the years he had lived, polished, bright. She stood there a long while with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She did not cry because she had cried for him already, in a church kitchen and a quiet apartment and 1,000 nights in between, and this was not a day for crying. This was a day for keeping a promise. She put 2 fingers to the brass the way you might touch a sleeping child's forehead so as not to wake it, and she stood with her hand there, until a young technician came in early and saw her and did not interrupt, sensing without knowing why that he had walked into something he should leave alone. Then she lowered her hand and squared the cloth. She still, out of long habit, carried in her pocket, and she went back to work. Ngozi finished medical school. At the ceremony, her mother sat in the front row in a good dress, an immigrant chemist's widow who had been mocked for the way she said the word water by a man who did not know he worked for her, and watched her quiet daughter cross the stage with her father's patience and her mother's spine. Afterward, Ngozi asked her, half teasing, whether she ever wished she had ended that man on the spot, as she had wanted to that night on the phone. Adays thought about it, honestly, as she thought about everything. She said no. She said that ending a man teaches the room only that you are strong. She said letting a man end himself, while you protect the people he would have crushed, teaches the room what is true, and the truth lasts longer than fear. She said her husband had taught her that, and Gideon had taught her that, and a thinner membrane in a poisoned pipe had reminded her of it. Then she said the other thing, the thing she had carried since the funeral, where an old man dried dishes beside her in a church kitchen and told her she did not have to understand the legal machinery, and she had answered that she would learn it anyway. She said the world is full of people who decide what you are by the way you say a word, and that they are almost always wrong, and that the patient ones who are underestimated long enough come to hold a quiet kind of power, the kind that does not need to raise its voice because it has already signed the paper that matters. There is a small thing she kept from those nights on the executive floors that nobody knew about. In the bottom of her old cleaning cart before she gave it back to the vendor, there had been a spare coat, grey and unremarkable, the one she had once laid over a sleeping young man in the dark. She did not give that coat back. She took it home and hung it in her front closet, and on cold mornings, going out to the office that bore her husband's name in a building that bore an old kind man's name, she would sometimes take it instead of a better one. It still smelled faintly of floor wax and night. She wore it the morning the brass plate went up. She had it on when she touched her husband's name. And every time she put it on after that, she remembered the boy in the car, and the village she came from, and the man who had laughed at the way she said water, and never once guessed that the woman holding the rag had been holding, all along, the whole quiet weight of everything he stood inside. She had signed his paychecks, she had signed the order that took them away. And in between, she had emptied his wastebasket 200 times and never once let him make her smaller than she was. That is the part the men in suits will never understand. The woman with the rag was never small. They simply could not see, in the dim of a night floor, the size of what they were standing next to. She could. She had always been able to. And, in the end, so could everyone.